All right, we're up to Montreal in the low point series, and there really isn't an ugly jersey that I have in my collection. This is as close as you can get, and I like this one. So, uh, there really isn't. Now, people are gonna say, well, what about the jersey with the barber pole design? Yeah, I don't have it. It's the one I don't have in my collection, and it is a great sadness to me. But at the same time, when it came out, it's not like I was, going out and buying it at the time. That was before I had a channel. If I'd had a channel back then, and if it had the subscriber numbers I have now, I would have had it. If only for the conversations that could have started, and for the seizures it could have caused, because it's seizure inducing, right? But in general, Montreal's had a really pretty eventless jersey history. So I look forward to that part of that playlist where I go, here's Montreal and here's what it is. I mean, this is one of their centennial jerseys from back in 2009, and it shows just how much everything sort of stays the same with them. So yeah, from 1909 to 2009. So they predate the NHL. They predate the NHL. They won one Stanley Cup before they were officially in the NHL. They've won 23 Stanley Cups as a National Hockey League team. If I don't say they've won 24 Stanley Cups overall, Montreal fans, let me know in the comment section below. So they've won 24 overall, 23 in the NHL, and we're going to move on. The most losses any goaltender suffered in their history is Carey Price with 250. Has to be mentioned, he's also got the most wins of any goaltender for the Montreal Canadiens, and Habs fans will point out that all 250 were not his fault. Defense in front of him. Now, with lost asset, that's where things get interesting. It depends on how you define the lost asset. So you could mention Pierre Turgeon here. You could mention Ryan McDonough here. You could mention a lot of guys that have been moved out. Now, I went with 6, but I'm sure there's others that can be mentioned below. I went with 6. If you want to mention Pacioretty, I thought about it, but they got Suzuki back in that deal, and they got Tatar. So that deal worked out pretty well. So Denny Savard was supposed to be the number 1 draft pick, but they drafted Doug Wickenheiser instead. That's why Denny Savard's on the board. Just imagine if they drafted Denny Savard and added him to a team that already had that Lafleur guy on it. Patrick Roy, of course, famously ends up going to the Colorado Avalanche. I've pointed out how it didn't sink Montreal right away. It didn't sink them that season, but Patrick holding up a Stanley Cup in 96, and then he did it again in 2001. And in 95, 96, the storyline was that Patrick Roy's best days were behind him, and maybe it was time to move on from him. And in hindsight, that was premature thinking. Chris Chelios. Oddly enough, Chris Chelios was acquired for Denny Savard. So they bring in Denny Savard from Chicago, and they give up Chelios to make it happen. And that was a mistake as well. So they made 2 mistakes with Savard in not drafting him and then in trading for him. And while, yes, they win the Stanley Cup with Denny Savard in 93, and it's a great story, giving up Chelios, it makes it kind of bittersweet. Chelios would go on to play for the next, I believe, 50 years after that deal. Now, John LeClair also stands out, and Eric Desjardins goes to Philadelphia as well. So, John LeClair, Desjardins, and of course, Dom Foose, and you can mention any number of players. Réjean Houle really kind of just stripped things down to the bare minimum. When he was running the team, and GMs around that time, not some great deals being made. So while people complain about Bergevin now, notice Subban's not on the board. At the time Subban got traded, it was seen as a horrible deal. You know what? Shea Weber's still a pretty darn good defenseman, and PK Subban is not living up to his contract right now with New Jersey. He's not even in Nashville, the team that traded for him, so he's not on the board. Jurke Lume does stand out as a defenseman they traded, and I remember having a reaction when Lume was traded to Vancouver of, thanks, Montreal. Now, Montreal at the time, they had a lot of defensemen, so there was kind of a logjam, and Lume was seen as a guy who had some value that they could trade. But did they get full value back? No. Did Lume go on to be a pretty solid defenseman for Vancouver for years? Absolutely. So that, in retrospect, was short-sighted on Montreal's part. And then Rod Langway, who was traded, and that feels like it was a lost asset because Langway had a pretty decent career in Washington. So, yeah, I mean, I did like what Green and Walter brought to the team, but trading out Langway for that, it does feel like that was probably short-sighted again. which is where Montreal's trade record sometimes gets kind of spotty. And at some point, I'm going to do a video series as well on trade histories, because it gets really interesting when you get into a team like Montreal. So I know I started a trade history thing and then I dropped it, but at some point I'm going to get back into it. I'll just do it differently. So short-term coach, 1996, Jacques Laperriere lasted one game. He lost it. So one game. That's the ultimate interim coach right there. One game. Jules Dougal, 1939, had a record of 9-6-3 in his time behind the bench. And Bernie Geoffrion in 1980, you may better remember him as Boom Boom Geoffrion, 15-9-6 in 1980 with him behind the bench. And so those are your short-term coaches for Montreal. Notice there's multiple players where normally I would only have the one, because their history is so long and so controversial at the same time. Not in the Hall of Fame, so highest point producer in the team's history and the guy with the most wins that is retired and not in the Hall of Fame. Saku Koivu, probably not a Hall of Famer, but Saku Koivu, if you're going to have a Hall of Fame wing for guys who fought through injuries and somehow made their careers last a lot longer than it looked like they should have, Saku Koivu is going to be the guy that you might name the wing after. And Bunny Larocque, Michel Larocque, goaltender, not in the Hall, and of course famously was traded to Toronto as they buried him. That was the move at the time, was, okay, we're not happy with Michel Larocque, and Michel Larocque wasn't happy with the team. So they tried to bury him in Toronto, and then they tried to make sure that he didn't get his name on the Vezina trophy, which was handed out to the best goals against average. And so the Vezina was changed coming out of that year. And instead we get the Jennings trophy for best goals against. So yeah, Michel Larocque and that deal and all that. And I've already done a video on that, on the how Montreal changed the rules. Not intentionally. It wasn't Montreal tried to change the rules. It was the NHL looked at what Montreal did and said, that's not good. We can't be doing that. So, longest drought. When you get into longest drought from the playoffs, Montreal doesn't have really a long drought. 1920 through 22 and 1999 through 2001. 3 seasons. Twice. That's it. So, Montreal fans, if you're feeling impatient about getting back to the playoffs, I understand, because you guys don't spend a lot of time outside the playoffs. And 24 Stanley Cups, like I said, 23 in the NHL, but none since 1993. That is a huge drought. By Montreal standards, that's a crazy drought. It's almost 30 years. And of course, that was the last Stanley Cup won by a team that plays in Canada. Notice I didn't say Canadiens, because there are Canadian hockey players that win the Stanley Cup every year. But it is notable just how long it's been since Montreal won the Stanley Cup. But there's been some missteps along the way, where you look at some of these names and think, how many more cups could they have won if they had really run things well when it came to trading and drafting and all that other wonderful stuff. Their first year in the National Hockey League, 1917-18. So not their first year overall. That would have been back in 1909. 13-9, 26 points. They lost the Stanley Cup final that year to the Toronto Arenas, who were considered an expansion team, but it was the first year for the NHL, so you tell me. Year 11, 1927-28, they finished 26-11-7, 59 points. They had won 3 Stanley Cups in the National Hockey League by then, 4 overall. So Montreal by year 11 was already kind of one of the championship standards, and it was between them and the original Ottawa Senators for who the most dominant team was at that point. Lowest points percentage against any given team, Minnesota, 400. They're 400 against Minnesota. Goals for per game against Nashville. They have the lowest number of goals scored against any team in the NHL, 2.22. Goals against per game, they've allowed the most against Vegas, 3.83. That is a small sample size, so Edmonton's second on the board at 3.33. And of course, a lot of that's going to be during the Gretzky era, when things were really kind of wide open. So we continue the run of teams from the 90s expansions being the team you have the fewest goals against, and goals against per game being high against a team that was pretty good in the 80s. So those marks continue. Now, goalie with the best name, Frenchie Lacroix. Doesn't Frenchie Lacroix sound like a name that you'd hear in a Bugs Bunny cartoon? It sounds like a name that somebody comes up with just trying to get into a bar that only caters to French people. Yeah, I'm French. What's your name? Frenchie Lacroix. All right, come on in. Or it sounds like a villain from Rocky and Bullwinkle. So that's That's what I'm thinking of when I see the name Frenchy Lacroix. And it's a fun name to say. And in terms of most of their goaltenders have just had French names. And so there hasn't been a whole lot of, hey, really cool, fun names when it comes to Montreal. They need more Finns. They need more Finn goaltenders. So, lowest points per game played, minimum of 100 games played as a Montreal Canadien. And Brett Clark, .049, is your leader there. Gerald Carson, .086. If you don't remember him, that's because he was born in, I think it was 1935. Donald Brashear, .090. Hal Lako, .116. And Tom Pyatt gets on the board with a .119. Congratulations, Tom Pyatt. You're on the board as one of the bottom 5 in points scored per game. Minimum of 100 games played as a Montreal Canadien. Lowest save percentage, minimum of 50 games played. This is, of course, during the year they've been keeping track of save percentages. Doug Sotart, 873, is at the low on this board. Rick Walmsley, 876. Surprised Walmsley's low on this list. I liked Rick Walmsley. Andre Rasico, 880. Anybody's going to act surprised? Don't. In fact, there may be some that are surprised that there's 2 goaltenders lower than Andre Rasico, in which case I would remind you, Rasico started out as okay. He started out as a half-decent looking goaltender, and then it just melted away from him. And Richard Sevigny, 887, which isn't bad for the 80s again. But Sevigny, Sotart, Walmsley, that's all around that early 80s period for the Montreal Canadiens. So there you go. The low points of the Montreal Canadiens, with most of the focus being on the lost asset part of it. It does feel like Montreal's going through a low point, and it's because they kind of sort of are. If they didn't make the playoffs in 2020, that'd be 3 years in a row, and that would tie them for their overall record as a franchise. And there's no guarantee they get back next year. So is Montreal eventually going to end up in an actual rebuild situation that we've never seen Montreal in? Who knows? But the lows are still not that bad, and the overall highs have been pretty darn good. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.